In the final days of October 2002, 46-year-old Arthur Finch loaded his gear into his old Ford pickup truck and set off for the Appalachian Mountains. Deer hunting season was in full swing, and Arthur, as he had every autumn for the past 15 years, planned to spend several days in the woods. His wife, Margaret, knew his usual route in the northern part of the Nantahala National Forest in North Carolina, where Arthur typically set up camp near an old forest road. Arthur worked as a mechanic at a local service station and lived in the small town of Franklin. His 2 adult children had already moved to other states. Margaret later told investigators that her husband planned to return on Sunday, October 27th. He took his hunting rifle, a sleeping bag, enough canned food for 3 days, and a thermos of coffee. Margaret helped him load his belongings into the bed of the pickup and noted that Arthur was in excellent spirits, looking forward to the upcoming hunt. Before leaving, Arthur stopped by the service station to see his boss, Richard Rick Miller, and told him he was taking time off until Monday. Miller was aware of Arthur's hunting trips and did not object. Around noon, Arthur purchased ammunition at a local sporting goods store. The clerk, David Chen, later recalled that the customer seemed calm and even joked about finally getting away from the city noise. After lunch, Arthur drove into the mountains. His route took him along Highway 28, then onto winding mountain roads toward the forest ranger station. Margaret knew her husband usually stopped at a specific spot near a small clearing where the forest road ended in a thicket. From there, he would continue on foot to his favorite hunting spots. By Friday evening, Margaret was not worried. Arthur often spent the night in the forest, especially when the weather was good. She was not concerned on Saturday either. Her husband could get carried away with hunting and stay out for another day. But by Sunday, when Arthur had not returned home or made contact, Margaret began to grow nervous. Arthur did not have a cell phone. He considered them useless in the mountains where there was no reception anyway. On Monday morning, October 28th, Margaret called the county sheriff's office. The duty officer filed a missing person report and stated a search party would be deployed that afternoon. Margaret provided a detailed description of her husband, 5'10", tall, weighing about 170 pounds, with graying brown hair and brown eyes. He was wearing an orange hunting jacket, jeans, and brown boots. The first search party found Arthur's pickup truck just a few hours later. The blue 1987 Ford was located exactly where expected, at the end of the forest road in a small clearing. The vehicle was locked, and the keys were on the driver's seat. All of Arthur's belongings were found in the truck bed. His sleeping bag, a backpack with canned food, a thermos, and even his Remington hunting rifle with a full magazine of ammunition. Deputy Sheriff Robert Hayes, leading the search, immediately realized something was wrong. An experienced hunter would never leave his rifle in the vehicle when heading into the woods. Furthermore, the backpack with food and the sleeping bag were also untouched. It seemed as if Arthur had simply gotten out of his truck and disappeared without taking any of the necessities for hunting or spending a night in the forest. The search party consisted of 8 people, 4 deputies and 4 volunteers from the local search and rescue team. They began combing the forest within a 1-mile radius of the truck, moving in a spiral pattern and checking every trail and ravine. The weather was sunny but cool. The leaves on the trees had already turned yellow and fallen, making for better visibility in the woods. By Monday evening, the search had yielded no results. the group returned to base, intending to continue the next day. On Tuesday, 12 more volunteers joined the effort, including Arthur's neighbors and colleagues from the service station. The search radius was expanded. They checked all streams, ravines, caves, and rock ledges in the vicinity. On the third day, Wednesday, a canine team arrived from a neighboring county. 2 specially trained German shepherds picked up Arthur's scent from his vehicle, but lost the trail after a few hundred yards. The trail simply vanished, as if Arthur had dissolved into thin air. The dog handler, David Miller, explained that this could happen for a variety of reasons, from rain washing away the scent to the person getting into another vehicle. By the end of the first week, more than 30 people were involved in the search. Local residents organized hot meals for the search parties, and posters with Arthur's photo were put up around town. Margaret came to the search site every day, telling anyone who would listen that her husband would never get lost in this forest. He knew these woods like the back of his hand. The search parties checked all known trails within a 5-mile radius of Arthur's truck. They searched abandoned cabins, old mines left over from the gold rush era in those parts, and even several derelict farms on the forest's edge. They found nothing. No signs of a struggle, no torn clothing, no personal items belonging to Arthur. In the second week, a helicopter joined the search. The pilots flew over the entire area, paying particular attention to the most inaccessible parts of the forest. The helicopter was equipped with a thermal imager capable of detecting a body, even one covered by a layer of leaves. But the aerial search also proved fruitless. Sheriff Walter Phillips personally took control of the case. He interviewed all local residents who might have seen Arthur's truck on the day he disappeared. It turned out that several people had noticed a blue Ford on the mountain road on the afternoon of October 24th, but no one saw the driver himself, and no one paid much attention to the vehicle. During hunting season, such trucks were a common sight in the mountains. Investigators also checked the possibility of an accident. There were deep gorges in the area where a person could have fallen and died. Rescue climbers descended into all accessible crevices and canyons, but no body was found. They also considered a bear attack. There were black bears in the Appalachians that were preparing for hibernation in the fall and could be aggressive, but no signs of a struggle with an animal were found. After 3 weeks of intensive searching, by mid-November, the sheriff was forced to officially suspend the operation. By that time, the first snow had already covered the ground, making further searches virtually pointless. The case of Arthur Finch's disappearance was classified as unsolved. Although it was not formally closed, Margaret Reed could not come to terms with her husband's vanishing. After the official search was called off, she continued to drive to the forest regularly, hoping to find at least some clue. Every weekend she parked her car near the spot where Arthur's pickup had been found and walked the trails for hours, carefully examining every bush and every stone. Neighbors and friends tried to dissuade her from these trips, but Margaret was adamant. The winter of 2002-2003 was severe. Snow lay in the mountains until mid-March, completely ruling out any search activity. But as soon as the spring thaw began, Margaret got back to work. She drew up a detailed map of all the places that had already been searched and began methodically examining areas that the search teams might have missed. Sheriff Phillips occasionally sent a patrol car into the forest to check for new leads. Deputy sheriffs questioned tourists and hunters who visited the area, but no one could provide any useful information. The Arthur Finch case was gradually forgotten, although his photo still hung on the bulletin board in the sheriff's office. In the summer of 2003, a small fire broke out in the forest. The fire destroyed about 100 acres of forest, mostly dry underbrush and small trees. After the fire was extinguished, foresters surveyed the burned area and found several animal bones, but nothing that could have belonged to a human. Margaret personally came to look at the ashes, but found nothing there either. In the fall of 2003, exactly 1 year after Arthur's disappearance, a local resident named Carl Jenkins contacted the sheriff's department. He said that while hunting, he had stumbled upon a strange place in the forest, an area where the grass was much greener and thicker than the surrounding area. According to Jenkins, this usually happens where organic matter gets into the ground. Deputy Sheriff Hayes went to the site and indeed found a suspicious area. They brought shovels and started digging. At a depth of 3 feet, they came across a large, flat stone that had clearly been placed there artificially. There was a hole under the stone, but it was empty, containing only a few small animal bones and old tin cans. Apparently, someone had used this place as a dump many years ago. Margaret, who had rushed to the excavation site, was very disappointed. By 2004, interest in the Arthur Finch case had finally died down. The new sheriff, who had replaced Phillips, had more pressing crimes to deal with. Theft was on the rise in the county, and a veritable epidemic of drug trafficking had begun in neighboring areas. The department's resources were directed toward combating these problems. Margaret, meanwhile, continued her search, although not as regularly as before. She hired a private investigator from Asheville, but after a month of work, he was unable to find any new leads. The detective suggested that Arthur might have decided to start a new life and disappeared deliberately. But Margaret categorically rejected this version. She knew her husband better than anyone and was sure he would never leave her without an explanation. In 2005, Margaret moved to Georgia to live with her daughter. She sold the house in Franklin and spent some of the money on private investigators and search operations. Before leaving, she visited the place where her husband had disappeared for the last time. Arthur's old pickup truck had already been taken from the impound lot and sold at auction. The clearing where it had stood was overgrown with tall grass. In the spring of 2006, the case took an unexpected turn. A human skull was found in the forest. Forestry workers who were clearing fallen trees from a stream bed stumbled upon the bone a few miles from the site of Arthur's disappearance. The skull was sent for examination, and the results showed it belonged to a Caucasian male between the ages of 40 and 50. Margaret immediately flew in from Georgia as soon as she heard about the discovery. The examination showed that the skull had been in the ground for 3 to 5 years, which coincided with the time of Arthur's disappearance. However, it was not possible to identify the remains with certainty. The skull was badly damaged, and the teeth were partially destroyed. DNA analysis was expensive and not always accurate at the time, especially when dealing with badly decomposed remains. The search resumed, this time focusing on the area where the skull was found. The area within a half-mile radius was combed with metal detectors in the hope of finding Arthur's personal belongings, his wedding ring, watch, or at least metal parts of his clothing. But the search was again unsuccessful, and 2 weeks later, the operation was called off. Meanwhile, there was a change in leadership at the sheriff's department. The new sheriff, David Harris, decided to review all unsolved cases from the past 10 years. The Arthur Finch case turned out to be one of the most mysterious. Harris personally studied all the materials and concluded that the search had been conducted correctly, but that some important details may have been overlooked. He instructed Detective Mark Stevens to re-interview all of Arthur's witnesses and acquaintances. During these interviews, some interesting details came to light. Several neighbors said that Arthur had a conflict with another local resident, Christopher "Chris" Dowell, who lived a few miles from the Finch home. The conflict concerned property boundaries. Dowell claimed that Arthur had illegally erected a fence and enclosed part of his land. The dispute had been going on for several years and had even gone to court, but no final resolution had been reached. Witnesses said the men had argued loudly several times, and once it had almost come to blows. Detective Stevens decided to talk to Christopher Dowell. Dowell was 52 years old, worked as a carpenter, and lived alone in an old farmhouse on the edge of the forest, about 10 miles from where Arthur had disappeared. Neighbors described him as a withdrawn and quick-tempered man who preferred to solve problems with force rather than conversation. When Stevens arrived at Dowell's house, Dowell was acting nervous. When asked where he was on the day Arthur disappeared, Dowell replied that he didn't remember, that too much time had passed. He said he had heard about his neighbor's disappearance, but had never participated in the search because he and Arthur didn't get along. Dowell also mentioned that he often hunted in the same forest where Arthur disappeared, but he had not been there that day. Stevens noted that Dowell corrected his testimony several times, as if trying to remember a pre-planned version. It seemed particularly suspicious that Dowell first said he was working in his workshop on the day of Arthur's disappearance, and then claimed that he had visited relatives in a neighboring town. The detective recorded all the contradictions, but at that point it was not enough for an official charge. 2 years later, in the spring of 2007, an event occurred that completely changed the course of the investigation. A group of teenagers from a local school decided to explore abandoned buildings in the forest for a school project on the history of the region. Among them were 16-year-old Jason Cole, his younger brother Brad, and their friend Mike Davis. The boys knew of several old farms that had been abandoned in the 1950s, when many local residents moved to the cities. One of these farms was about a mile from where the skull was found, and 3 miles from the clearing where Arthur's pickup truck was discovered. The farm had belonged to the McClellan family, who grew tobacco and kept a small herd of cows. After the death of Old Man McClellan in 1954, his children sold the land to the forestry department, and the buildings remained abandoned. By 2007, all that remained of the farm were the stone foundations of the main house, a dilapidated barn, and an old well. The well was located away from the main buildings in a small grove. It was lined with stone and was about 20 feet deep. The well used to be covered with a wooden lid, but by the time the teenagers visited, it had rotted and fallen inside. Instead, someone had placed a heavy concrete slab over it, completely covering the opening. Jason Cole was the first to notice that the slab looked relatively new compared to the old, moss-covered stones of the well. The boys tried to move the slab to look inside, but it was too heavy. Then they brought an old iron pipe from the ruins of the shed and used it as a lever. After half an hour of effort, they managed to move the slab a few inches. Jason shone his flashlight into the gap that had formed, and saw something white at the bottom of the well. At first, he thought it was rocks or debris, but upon closer inspection, he realized he was looking at human bones. The boys immediately stopped trying to move the slab and drove to town to report their discovery to the sheriff's department. Detective Stevens arrived at the abandoned farm 40 minutes after the teenagers' call. He was accompanied by a group of technical experts and a photographer. The first thing they did was cordon off the area around the well with yellow tape and begin photographing the site from all angles. The concrete slab did indeed look much newer than the stonework of the well. There was no moss on it, and the edges were relatively clean. Special equipment was called in to lift the slab. A crane operator carefully hooked the slab with steel cables and lifted it. Under the slab, they found a complete human skeleton lying at the bottom of the well. The bones were partially covered with fallen leaves and dirt, but the overall picture was clear. These were definitely human remains. Forensic expert Dr. Eleanor Washington descended into the well on safety ropes to conduct a preliminary examination. The first thing she noticed was that the skeleton's hands were tied behind its back with the remains of a rope. The legs were also tied at the ankles. This immediately ruled out the possibility of an accident and pointed to foul play. There were 2 large holes in the skull, one in the temporal region and the other in the occipital region. Dr. Washington suggested that these were marks left by a blunt object. In the chest area, she found several cuts on the ribs, which could have been knife wounds. The exact cause of death could only be determined after a detailed examination in the laboratory. Fragments of clothing lay next to the skeleton pieces of denim and the remains of leather boots. The metal parts of the clothing buttons, zippers, belt buckles were heavily corroded, but still distinguishable. A leather wallet was found in the jeans pocket, which, despite damage from moisture, could still be examined. When the remains were brought to the surface, it became clear that the skeleton belonged to a man of medium height and build. A preliminary age estimate indicated between 40 and 50 years old. All of these parameters matched the description of Arthur Finch. However, final identification could only be made through DNA analysis or dental records. Detective Stevens immediately contacted Margaret Reed in Georgia and reported the discovery. The woman arrived in Franklin the next day. She brought her husband's medical records with her, including dental X-rays taken several years earlier. She also provided DNA samples, Arthur's hair from his comb, which she had kept intact all those years. The examination of the wallet yielded the first concrete results. Despite the damage, it was possible to recover the driver's license number. It did indeed belong to Arthur Finch. The wallet also contained the remains of several banknotes and a credit card with Arthur's name on it. This made it almost certain that the remains found belonged to the missing hunter. Dental examination confirmed the assumptions. Dr. James Kilpatrick compared the skeleton's teeth with Arthur's X-rays and found a perfect match. Particularly telling was an old filling in the upper left molar. It was exactly the same as the one in the 2001 X-ray. DNA analysis conducted at the state laboratory finally confirmed the identity of the deceased. Now, the investigation was no longer a missing person case, but a murder case. Sheriff Harris personally took control of the investigation and appointed Detective Stevens to lead the case. First, they returned to examining the circumstances of Arthur's disappearance and began compiling a list of suspects. The forensic examination showed that Arthur died from multiple stab wounds to the chest and abdomen. A total of 7 wounds were found, 3 of which damaged vital organs. The blows to the head were inflicted with a blunt object, possibly a hammer or a heavy stone. The experts suggested that the victim was first beaten and then finished off with a knife. The rope used to tie Arthur's hands and feet turned out to be common household cord sold in any hardware store. There were no special marks or manufacturing labels on it. The knots were tied simply, without any special skills, which ruled out the possibility of a professional killer. The murder clearly did not take place in the well. There was too little blood for such a number of stab wounds. Arthur was killed somewhere else, and then his body was carried to the well and thrown in. A concrete slab was placed on top to hide the crime. This indicated that the killer knew the area and had planned in advance how to dispose of the body. Detective Stevens compiled a chronology of events. Arthur disappeared on the afternoon of October 24, 2002. His body was discovered on April 23, 2007. During that time, someone must have brought a heavy concrete slab to the farm and placed it on the well. One person could not lift such a slab. Either machinery or the help of several people was needed. Investigators questioned all local residents who might have seen or heard something. The farm was located away from the main roads, but hunters and berry pickers sometimes stopped by. Several witnesses recalled seeing a truck near the old farm in late 2002 or early 2003, but no one could remember the make or license plate number. Special attention was paid to Christopher Dowell. His farm was only 2 miles from where Arthur's body was found. He had a truck with a crane, which he used for work, transporting lumber and installing wooden structures. Such a crane could easily lift and install a concrete slab on a well. When Detective Stevens visited Dowell again, he became even more nervous. When asked if he had ever been to the old McClellan farm, Dowell said no, but then corrected himself and said that he might have driven past it. He claimed that he knew nothing about the concrete slab and had never seen the well. Stevens asked for permission to search Dowell's house and workshop. Dowell agreed, but it was clear he was very nervous. In the workshop, the detective found several concrete slabs of exactly the same size and shape as the one covering the well. Dowell explained that he used them as bases for wooden structures, but could not say exactly how many slabs he had originally had. The truck with the crane was parked in the garage. The vehicle was old, but in good working order. Stevens noticed scratches and dents on the body, but Dowell said they were normal damage from work. The detective photographed the truck from all sides and asked Dowell for permission to take paint samples for examination. The most interesting find was in the attic of the house. Climbing up there, Stevens saw a lot of old things: furniture, boxes of papers, hunting equipment. In the corner, under a pile of old blankets, he found an orange hunting jacket. The jacket was the same size and style as the one Arthur Finch was wearing on the day of his disappearance. Dowell claimed that the jacket belonged to him, and that he had bought it several years ago at a local store. But Stevens noticed dark stains on the jacket that looked like dried blood. He seized the jacket for examination despite Dowell's protests. The detective also took DNA samples from Dowell's strands of hair and a scraping from his mouth. The examination of the blood on the jacket yielded sensational results. DNA analysis showed that the stains belonged to Arthur Finch. Moreover, The blood type matched the records in the deceased's medical file. This was direct evidence that the jacket was connected to the murder. When Stevens presented Dowell with the results of the examination, he initially claimed that the jacket was not his and that he had no idea how it had ended up in his attic. Then he said that he might have bought it second-hand from one of the local hunters, but he could not explain how Arthur's blood ended up on the jacket. The detective obtained a warrant for Christopher Dowell's arrest on suspicion of murder. The arrest took place early in the morning on April 27, 2007. Dowell was detained at his home without resistance. Upon arrest, he claimed he was innocent and demanded a lawyer. The house was thoroughly searched, and a large amount of physical evidence was seized for further investigation. Dowell spent 3 days in a holding cell, refusing to give a statement. His lawyer, Robert Henderson, argued that all the evidence against his client was circumstantial and did not prove his guilt. The jacket could have ended up with Dowell in various ways, and there was no evidence to confirm his presence at the old farm. The breakthrough in the case came when investigators decided to take another detailed look at Dowell's workshop. Using luminol, a chemical that glows when it comes into contact with blood, experts discovered a large stain on the workshop floor that had been thoroughly cleaned, but traces of blood remained in the cracks between the boards. Analysis of these blood stains again showed a match with Arthur Finch's DNA. This meant that the murder had taken place in Dowell's workshop. A knife with a deer antler handle was also found in the workshop, and microscopic traces of blood and bone fragments were found on the blade, which matched the wounds on Arthur's skeleton. Faced with irrefutable evidence, Christopher Dowell agreed to testify. On April 30, 2007, in the presence of his lawyer and Detective Stevens, he recounted how the murder of Arthur Finch had taken place. His confession fully explained all the circumstances of the crime, which had remained unsolved for almost 5 years, putting a final, tragic end to this long story.